I also, if I may, want to comment a little bit about the sense of, social responsibility and business and so on. I think one thing we must, keep in mind that the biggest thing actually is self-interest. And what we're really looking for is enlightened self-interest, not so much saying this is charity or doing good or, I think all of us want to do what is the right thing, but if it's helped along by enlightened self-interest, it often works extremely well. I mean, IKEA clearly is an example of that. I spent 35 years in McKinsey. We did an enormous amount of work in giving back to the business communities and societies we worked in, whatever form that we could, which is what we were good at. Now, why did we do it? Not only because we felt it was the right thing to do, but very importantly because that was the reason why some of the outstanding men and women around the world would come and work with us. They not only wanted to work on business issues, they wanted to work on larger societal issues and give back to the community. That really allowed us to attract the best resources. And that gave us great competitive advantage. So it was in our self-interest to give back to society. Obviously, it's in the business's self-interest to give back to society. The society is, we work with the permission of society. They're our customers, they're our employees. So if we don't have a healthy society, if we don't, then we, in the long term, don't have any business. So, I like to think of it as a virtuous cycle where we can actually work in each other's wonderful self-interest, but have it be an enlightened one. I think that there is no question if one could wave a magic band and have the Nordic model the world over, it would be a much better place than it is today, I think. I am a very big fan of it.
Well, don't be too certain. I mean, it could be also a very boring place, no?
Well, we talked about primarily the economic and social dimensions. I'm not talking about the vibrancy of the if you I grew up in India, and the colors, smells, noises, dresses, I don't think you could quite match that here. And in that context, it's probably a little boring and dull, but sometimes that's good.
From Swedish from 8 a.m. till 6 p.m. and then Indian from 6 p.m. until next morning. Mr. Prime Minister, you said you think it's a good thing that Norway has been egalitarian. This place, Scandinavia, has been egalitarian. My impression is that we're changing. I mean, the rich are becoming richer, and they're becoming much more rich than the production floor, than the average person. This is a place where the Prime Minister would go at the tram. Even the King once took the tram. Where the CEO would earn perhaps 4 or 5 times what the worker would have. Now it's changing. Some would say that perhaps the young consultants of some of the consultancy firms are saying you have to be competitive. You have to be competitive. You have to increase social disparity in a way. Go for the best and pay them a lot. Is this good or bad? I think it's bad if I follow your first argument.
Yeah, the main problem is, of course, not that we have rich people. It's more a question of what are the rich people doing with the richdom. But and the main thing is to lift up poor people out of poverty. And when I was Prime Minister, that was really a matter of concern to us, and we made a white paper to the Parliament proposing different means of lifting also poor people in Norway out of poverty. But to some extent, I also do agree that it is a matter of concern if the differences are increasing. Not because it's a problem to have rich people, but it can be a source of unrest and conflicts in a society if the differences are too big. So therefore, I think it is good if we could manage to run a policy where we can say that our Nordic countries still are rather egalitarian. So I think we should put focus on that. I also fully agree with Mr. Gupta that it's not a contradiction between self-interest and ethical values. I think business people really should acknowledge that in the long term, following high ethical standards is also in the self-interest of their business and companies, no doubt. Because it will be focused on ethical values, on anti-corruption, on transparency, equality, and some of the other values which I mentioned. So I'm fully convinced that it will be to the self-interest of business people to follow these ethical guidelines. And the Nordic model, well, when I'm traveling around in different countries, also in my capacity now as president of the Oslo Center, for instance, in some African countries like Kenya, there is real interest. And they ask me very often, how have you organized your country? And how is the Nordic model? And so on. So to some extent, I will say that the Nordic model is well known. And we shall not come down to Africa and other countries and impose a model on them, of course. We have to take into account the culture and the background for these countries. But without imposing them, I think we can encourage them to follow some of the main social ethical guidelines as we are doing in Norway. Since we have the CEO of IKEA here, can I tell you a little funny story about how we can debate in the Nordic countries about some of the values I mentioned, namely equality between men and women. I don't know if you were the CEO when I was a prime minister, but nevertheless, it happened so that IKEA's advertisements in Norwegian newspapers, I think some of you are familiar with them, when you advertised your products in our newspapers, you always had pictures of these flat packages, which IKEA is very well known for, and where the buyers of these furnitures had to pull out all the pieces from the package and put it together to a complete furniture. It was always a man on the pictures who did this job. Why? Why not a woman? And I, as Prime Minister, made a remark on that. And it was a rather great attention to this remark. And especially because in my home, it's always my wife who do that job, because she's much better than me to do it. So when I was interviewed by Al Jazeera now, some weeks ago in New York, they have picked up this, what happened some years ago when I made this remark. And they asked now, is there a change in the advertisements of IKEA? I assume it is now, isn't it? Is it more equality now in your advertisement?
I'm sure this was before my time.
I think it was before your time,
Sure
almost 10 years ago. I think.
I'm sure it was.
I hope.
Yeah.
Thank you on that. Well, actually, you were Prime Minister while he was CEO. So let's take that afterwards. Let's now use the last minutes then to look at the future. I think all of you said that it is not only in conformity with the ideals of humankind, but also in the self-interest of companies to have an ethical basis. Are we sure that we're seeing a positive trend line in more ethics in business worldwide? And why is that? There are so many examples of a more and more globalized capital going after the raw materials where the control is the least strong. It's hard to find national laws to come after them. There are tax havens, there are mining companies making money of the worst and most despicable conditions, etc. Are we sure it's going in the right direction? And why? Mr. Gupta.
Well, I think net, I cannot comment. Obviously, many are going in the right direction, but there are obviously examples where they are not. I mean, clearly, while I made the case for business acting responsibly, ethically, we need the skills and so on and so forth, You also face a situation in the last couple of years, at least, in the financial crisis and so on, the respect with which business leaders are held around the world is probably at the lowest level in decades. So you have this contradiction of, I think there are many, many socially responsible businesses, and yet you have that. I also think that this is not, at least in the US, it's not singled out by business. I mean, the opinion of, low opinion of business leaders is only topped by lower opinion of politicians. So, it's not like there is, we have this situation now where clearly, the extraordinary freedom, and we talked about the internet today, the extraordinary freedom that the world is now affording us in how we conduct our business and so on and so forth, imposes extraordinary responsibilities. But the regulatory framework and the governance system in the world has not caught up with that, I think. And, I don't think, as they say, trust but verify, or, give free market but with, tough regulations. One of the things you did not mention, I think the regulatory framework here is probably quite tough in the Nordic model. So I think we have to do a fair amount of work on, at one level, the regulatory framework, because I don't think without that, markets function that well.
So who are we? I mean, nation states?
At
the regional organizations, the United Nations?
At every level. I think, clearly nation states have to do that, but I think there are many things that cannot be done at a nation, in this interdependent world. It's not sufficient to do it only on a nation state. I mean, clearly we saw in the financial crisis at least extraordinary cooperation between governments to, whatever might be said of it, but we averted a disaster by, collaboratively working together and coordinating. Now you see that slipping away a little bit. So I think there are many issues. I mean, obviously climate change is one, and that, you cannot act only on a national capacity. I mean, you have to have some coordination. But I guess to your broader point, I cannot pass judgment on saying that, is net getting better or worse. I am a, eternal optimist and a glass half full guy, and I see a lot of progress. I see lots of people coming out of poverty in the last decade than any time in history. So I'm hopeful about that. But at the same time, I think there is a huge, huge challenge confronting us, and long way to go.
But it seems like companies like IKEA and others who have taken a conscious decision to have ethical corporate social responsibility profile is doing better than when you were not. So is that perhaps one of the main arguments? It's good. It's good for business.
Yes, well, I believe, like Mr. Gupta said, that there seemed, to take that perspective first, there seemed to be a growing divide between business and the general public, or the perception of business from the general public. But I would think that with the introduction of internet, with the introduction of some regulations that have actually made information more public, I think we are today are much more aware of the, how shall I put it, the malpractices of business than we used to be. And it could be that overall businesses may be behaving even better today than they did in the past, just we didn't know it, because we weren't aware of it because of the lack of transparency and public awareness. I think too that the way to change this in a faster way towards more companies taking a bigger responsibility for a better society is, as Mr. Gupta said, the self-interest thing. I think even if we could change the purpose of business like IKEA to that the overriding purpose of business should be to contribute to a better society, and in the process we will make the owners richer or create wealth for the owners, and in the process probably also the managers.